Gang, I grew up in a family that was very proud of its Scandinavian heritage. Every year during the holidays, we'd make things like lefse, krumkake, kringla, and rumagrut, if you've even heard of those. It was a sin in our family not to have lutefisk and Swedish meatballs on Christmas Eve. In our family, a Norwegian sweater was more stylish than an Armani suit. And growing up, when it came to our heritage, I vaguely remember hearing stories of why my Norwegian ancestors came to America, why they made that harrowing trip in search of a new land. You see, I vaguely remember stories of Norway being overpopulated, poor growing conditions, limited farmland, but I never really got the full story. I never quite understood why anyone would leave that beautiful country until I actually got to go to Norway. Once in Norway, I saw for myself. I got, if you will, the full story. You see, in Norway, seeing the landscape, I was able to imagine what happened when the population doubled in the 1800s. People were clamoring for what I now saw with my own eyes. There's just small little patches of quality farmland. Yes, it's beautiful, but Norway is all rugged mountains, fjords, tundra. I imagine the million people who immigrated to Norway in the 1800s. Everyone wanted a piece of that small, scattered, farmable land. There was far too few and in between. With my own eyes, I was able to understand there was nowhere to sustain a livelihood. You see, traveling to Norway, I got the full story. Now, folks, today we're going to hear how Paul is going to give us the full story. Hey, thanks for joining us for another installment of our study of 1 Corinthians. We've called it The Good Life. And today, Paul, in chapter 15, verses 1 through 11, as he nears the end of his letter to the Corinthians, he wants to make certain that those Corinthians understand the full story, their family story, the story of what God did in Jesus. He wants to be certain they know who they are and whose they are and why the tradition he is teaching them is so important. Paul gets at the story of our roots, if you will, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In chapter 15, Paul is going to give us the full story of Jesus because for Paul, if we understand where we belong in God's story, so many other things that troubled those Corinthians and us for that matter, will we gain clarity in light of the full story. For example, in chapter 6, do you remember how Paul went on and on about the importance of sexual morality? Why did that matter so much to Paul? It mattered because in the death of Jesus, God paid a price for you. God bought you, if you will, and God will raise your body to new life as he raised Jesus. Your whole self, body included, is of infinite worth to God. So who you are and what you do in and with your present body, it matters. Here's another example. In chapter 11, Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist. This meal only makes sense in light of the full story. Without Jesus' death and resurrection, it's just bread and wine that we have at communion. In chapter 13, we heard Paul's beautiful words about love, words that are only comprehensible when we understand their place in God's story, that the death and resurrection of Jesus, it ushered in a whole new world, the kingdom of God. And love, the kind of love that God displayed in the death and resurrection of Jesus, that love, well, it's the one thing that will last into the new world. Nothing makes sense without the full story. In chapter 15, Paul gives us the full story, the death and resurrection of Jesus, the story of our roots, our heritage. Without it, nothing he says makes any sense. You see, for Paul, Christianity isn't a set of traditions like lutefisk and meatballs and Norwegian sweaters. Christianity is the good news about an event that actually happened in history and changed the world forever. And because of that event, for those who know the full story, we too will never be the same. Gang, here's a couple questions for you. Growing up, if you grew up in the faith, was faith more about the traditions of the church or the event of Jesus that changed the world? And here's another one. What does it mean that the story of Jesus is the story of your roots, your heritage? You don't get the full story without Jesus. What does that mean to you?